But I do think that a part of national life should be orienting the people to not just their temporal goods or their mash, as Richard Hooker would say, but to actually elevate them and encourage them to higher things. And you can only do that if Christians in general are the core political unit within a society.
I think missional Protestantism has been the basis for a more libertarian style of government, okay, or a focus on liberties from the tyrannies that were experienced in Europe. Where I would disagree with Stephen is that in that political Protestantism, what it became apparent very early was the necessity of the separation of church and state.
Hello and welcome to Unbelievable, the show that gets Christians and non-Christians discussing and debating the topics that matter to all of us. I'm your host, Billy Hallowell, and today we're talking about politics and faith. Should they mix? What do we mean when we use terms like Christian nationalism? Should we even have those two words in the same sentence? There are so many other questions that we are going to explore today. Some other ones just off the top of my head here. Should Christians be politically withdrawn? Should we avoid participation in politics to maintain a prophetic voice? Or should Christians be actively involved, seeking to utilize political systems to control the levels of power? At a time when discussions about Christian nationalism and debates over religion and politics too often involve mudslinging, it really creates more heat sometimes than light. And so we want to take a step back from that, and we want to look at what 2 millennia of global Christian history can teach us. Does biblical theology point us toward a defense of liberal democracy? Do the extremes of the left and the right leave the quieter middle disenfranchised? There are no easy answers here, but we hope to grapple across religious and political spectrums to find some points of connection in a polarized age. Now, there are plenty that my two guests today agree on and much that they do not. So I want to introduce them. We'll get right into it here. It's Stephen Wolfe, who holds a PhD from Louisiana State University and is a country scholar at Wolfshire in central North Carolina. He recently finished a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University's James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institution. Wolfe has written for Mere Orthodoxy, First Things, Chronicles Magazine, and History of Political Thought. The Case for Christian Nationalism is his first book. We're also going to be talking with Michael Bird. He's a deputy principal and lecturer in New Testament at Ridley College, Australia. He's the author of numerous scholarly and popular books on the New Testament and theology, including with NT Wright, The New Testament in Its World. His latest book is Jesus and the Powers, Christian Political Witness in an Age of Totalitarian Terror and Dysfunctional Democracies, co-authored with NT Wright. We want to make sure you hit that subscribe button today. As always, let us know which arguments convince you the most. If the show raises more questions for you, we would love to hear from you about that. But for now, we're going to dive into today's show. Now, Mike and Stephen, I want to welcome you both here. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so let's just start with a baseline. I want to ask first to you, Stephen. I want to just get a baseline of where you are on faith. Where do you stand when it comes to your faith? Give us just a quick recap of that.
So I guess to summarize, 2 words would be conservative Presbyterian or classical Presbyterian. So that would capture essentially my theology. Member of a Presbyterian church near my home. So basically, if you read Samuel Rutherford, that's probably pretty close to what I believe. So I think that summarizes it.
Very good. Very good. And Mike, how about you?
Yeah, I've been Jesus freaking since the mid-1990s, and I am now a evangelical Anglican in Australia. And I worship according to the one true form of righteous worship, which is the Book of Common Prayer.
All right. So, now that we have that baseline, we understand who you...
With a little bit of Hillsong thrown in.
A little bit of Hillsong thrown in. I love that. Well, now that we kind of have a baseline of who you are, I want to dive in right away to Christian nationalism. This is a term that when we throw it out there, many people have different definitions of what they believe it to be. And so, Stephen, I want to start with you. How would you define Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so in the book I have a more technical definition, but I think that it's probably easier to say that Christian nationalism is a nation or a people group that understands itself to be a Christian people. So they have that self-conception of themselves as we are Christian in a collective sense. And then they act collectively for their good. So in light of them being Christian, they say we ought to act for our good, and that's through custom and law. And so to arrange and order ourselves in light of that. And the end would be for their good, and that good is both temporal, spiritual, or earthly and heavenly. So that would be my definition of Christian nation. So that or Christian nationalism. Theism really refers to that sense of a collective self that then acts on for itself. And then the Christian nation itself is a nation, as I said, that understands itself as Christian. So this could apply to all sorts of very different nations. There could be a Hungarian Christian nationalism, a French Christian nationalism, an English Christian nationalism, an American Christian nationalism, and each one of those would be distinct with regard to the particulars and the application. So my theory is really a general theory for all different people groups, such that they can be both Christian and maintain their distinctive cultural inheritance.
Now, Mike, I want to get your definition of this, but before I do, is there anything in that definition that you would want to react or respond to?
Yeah, I think the big emphasis for Stephen, and you can correct me, it's very much about the people group, the ethnic group. So keeping them Christian, but keeping them insulated, distinct, and untainted by the culture, customs, and blood of other groups. And that's, I think, is a little bit more distinctive of Stephen's version. It is very much about the homogeneity of the ethnic group. Whereas I would tend to define Christian nationalism a little bit broader, that it's about making Christianity hegemonic and to some degree or other somewhat imposed by law. Okay, I think that covers some wider varieties of Christian nationalism. I think Stephen's is distinct because it is concerned with the more ethnic horizon, but I'll leave that up to Stephen to determine whether I've given him a fair summary of his view.
Yeah, I think using the word is fair. I kind of use an idiosyncratic definition of the word in the book, which has caused confusion, as people might expect. I thought I was, at least somewhat clear what I intended by it, but I used ethnicity instead of culture, even though I kind of meant culture plus there is a sense of ancestry. I don't know how you can have a nation in which you don't have some ancestral connection to the people in place. But you did say this idea of like pure and like separate. So I think a people group can be very welcoming and open to people who are of different ancestry. And the expectation would be that they would become one part, that they'd become part of that people through assimilation, intermarriage, and there could even be a sort of ethnogenesis that arises from different groups living in the same place. But my emphasis is that it's very natural for the human being to love the place that they live in part at least, in large part because their grandparents, great-grandparents, and lived in the same place. We're part of the same national struggles, part of the same national events. I mean, the United States and of course the Western world, I can go to someone on the street and they could probably have a story about what their grandfather, great-grandfather did in World War II. So there's that sort of national connection based upon ancestry that isn't necessarily rooted in blood. That is like, I could have a conversation with a guy who's 100% Italian, whose grandfather's in World War II fighting in the one of the theaters, and we would have that instant national connection based upon that national event. And it wouldn't be a matter of us like lining up our genetic test to see if we are a part of the same nation. So I use the word ethnicity because we can't lose the importance of that ancestral connection to the place. Even if I don't think a nation has to be a group of cousins by blood, but blood does matter in the sense that your extended family has been here and been part of this place for generations.
Well, can I just...
Mike, I want to give you a moment to respond, but I want to throw another word out. culture. Culture is a collection of values and practices, and sometimes that crosses over. I'm Italian, and in my Italian culture, there are things we do, but culture is a word that also comes into play here. Groups of people build cultures, obviously, and within a nation, there are many cultures, but there's also a national identity as well that would come with that. And I just wanted to throw that out there just as we're having this conversation, another definition there. But Mike, you were going to respond there. I'll allow you to do that.
Yeah. Based on what Stephen's saying, I mean, I've read the book, and there were a couple of things in the book that did disturb me a little bit, and I'm not easily disturbed. Probably the one line, and I'd love to see how you responded. At one point in the book, you talk about you don't want to rescind the citizenship of ethnic minorities, but you say you are open to, and this is a direct quote, an amicable ethnic separation along political lines.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
which sounds to me a little bit like a mutual segregation, or exporting all the blacks back to Liberia. That's because I've heard that's the sort of context, but an amicable ethnic separation along political lines.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you talk to Hungarians in Central or Eastern Europe, however you want to describe it, they'll talk about ethnic Hungarians in places like Ukraine and Slovenia and Romania. And when they talk about minority rights, what are they talking about? They want ethnic Hungarians within those countries to have a certain degree of political autonomy. And there's a lot of movements within those areas. You go to Slovenia, you go to, I don't know about Ukraine presently in this regard, but you go to Romania, and you'll have a lot of political activism precisely for that end, is to say we want to have autonomy relative to the ethnic Slovenians or the ethnic Romanians. And so that's kind of what I mean. I think that's precisely what I mean. And there's a lot of examples in the world precisely.
What does that mean in America, though? In America, how would that apply?
Yeah. So I want to say, first of all, that even though the cover does have America on the cover, really 9 chapters out of 10 are really just general political theory. I didn't always have America in mind whenever I wrote it. I didn't choose the cover. I like the cover, but that gives a misleading impression of what the book's about. I covered America in chapter 10. I realize, like, in America, that is a challenging. It's difficult to see how that would work out, simply because of American history, and there tends to be an impulse to have this Americanness despite differences, and so that is a challenge. I do think that in America there is. You see the problems that arise from the ethnic and cultural difference that has lasting problems. When I say that ethnic groups can have this friendly separation, that doesn't mean that they must have it. It just means that it's a possibility, it's permissible, given those circumstances. So I fully admit that America is this very strange place in which you have people living in groups. And really what's interesting, though, is that people do naturally kind of gravitate towards their particular ethnic group. You just look at an ethnic map of New York City, and you'll see clusters of dense clusters of different groups that have been drawn towards each other. And that's just a function of, I think, human nature, people wanting to live in a place in which they can understand each other well, have similar cultural values, perhaps have like marriage interests because they want to marry someone similar to themselves. But I guess to summarize that, I acknowledge the difficulty. So I'm not trying to evade it. I'm not trying to bring out some grand plan of racial separation in America. Nevertheless, I do think there is, in a political theory, a place for ethnic groups to say, hey, it'd be better if we just have a friendly separation and, had a political autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, I would respond by saying for most groups, the separation never tends to be friendly. And Bill, I just want to draw a point of contrast. You talked about the Hungarians, the ethnic Magyars. I would put a lot of space between you and Viktor Orban's Hungary. Orban accepted refugees from Syria if they were Christian. So Orban's view of, shall we call it, a broad Magyar Christian nation is creedal, whereas I know in your book you explicitly reject a creedal basis of your Christian nationalism. So it's not just people who are Christians. You also want people who actually belong to the place and people. So I would put a lot of space between you and Viktor Orban and his vision of Magyar Christian nationalism. Sorry, Billy, I've interrupted you.
No, you're fine. I mean, you mentioned, Mike, that there were a couple of things, Michael, in the book that disturbed you. When it comes to Christian nationalism, based on your definition of it from a 30,000-foot level, and I know I'm probably opening Pandora's box here, but I think it's a good place for us to start, Michael, what are the things that most concern you about this iteration right now of Christian nationalism as it pertains, particularly in the UK and America, to the political process?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest factor is the idea that Christians must be in charge, okay? I think that's very characteristic of American Christians. It can be a little bit in the UK, but I mean, the UK is interesting at the moment because, I mean, you've got a Christian king, a Hindu prime minister, you've got an atheist opposition leader, a Muslim first minister of Scotland, and I believe like a Buddhist immigration minister. So even under what is, a country with a established church where bishops are appointed through the crown, there is a certain degree of multiculturalism, a certain degree of secularity that leads to maximal political participation of people in different groups. So I find this very ironic. The one of the nations on earth which has a closer relationship between church and state compared to, say, Australia or America, is actually a far more liberal, multicultural, participationist democracy with an established church. So I find that interesting. And this would be my salient warning for Stephen. Even if you go into a close relationship with church and state, the outcome may not be what you thought. Because I'm pretty sure the people who put together the British Constitution never thought one day they'd have a Hindu prime minister, while the East India Company is doing their thing in India. I don't think anyone ever thought, that we'd be importing people to be our political leaders, and yet here we are in the 21st century. So I think there's a lot of different views, but the main thing is that Christians have to be in charge, and sometimes the end does not justify the means in bringing that about. And that's my real point of contention.
Stephen, how do you respond to that concern of this idea that Christians have to be in charge when it comes to this conversation surrounding Christian nationalism?
Yeah. So when you say they have to be in charge, I wouldn't say that they absolutely have to in every circumstance be in charge. I think actually a confident Christian majority can actually very well easily have just as much participation from the non-Christian groups, free. Everyone's free and equal as long as there's a kind of a confident Christian majority. And I think that the relationship of Americans to Jews after the founding is a good example of this, in which Jews can participate politically with few incidents here and there, but generally speaking, they could participate fully. They could be congressmen. They could be. I'm talking mainly about the 19th century, not kind of recently. And so when you have a confident Christian majority, certainly people can participate. But must they in every case? I mean, if Christians are 10% of the population, then no. But it would be. But I do think that a part of national life should be orienting the people to not just their temporal goods or their mash, as Richard Hooker would say, but to actually elevate them and encourage them to higher things. And you can only do that if Christians in general are the core political unit within a society. And that ought to be encouraged. Just like in a family, you want to have a family that's Christian, that they do Christian things, that encourages your children in the faith and your mutual encouragement in that little domestic society. The same thing would be true in a national society. So I think it's certainly preferable that Christians would be in charge for that end, so that this national society, something instituted by God for your good, would not limit itself to the temporal goods, but also encourage the highest good as well. So, leave it at that.
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead, Michael.
I do have a response to that. it's not just that. I mean, I understand your idea that Christians can live with not being in charge, and I believe Christians can have a positive influence. And I think having a Christian heritage is not something we should hide, but we should celebrate. But I just want to point out a few other things you say in your book, Stephen. You talk about how when Christians are in charge, you say non-Christians may be entitled to peace, justice, and safety, but you also say very explicitly they are not entitled to political equality. And also when it comes to other groups as well, you say the Christian posture towards the earth is that it is ours, not theirs, for we are co-heirs with Christ. You want to effectively introduce the Islamic concept of dimitude, second-class citizenship for non-Christians. I mean, so if Christians were in charge, they would become a elite political class with more rights than non-Christians. Or even not just non-Christians, the wrong type of Christians. I mean, I thought that's one of the things I found about your book. You never mentioned Catholics or Greek Orthodox, so I don't know what happens to them in your Christian America. But I mean, this was the stuff that. By the way, I should say there is some stuff in the book I can affirm, but this was the stuff in the book that I find really concerning.
So, we have to go to a break in a minute. Stephen, I want to give you a chance to start responding to that. And we'll pause and we'll pick back up on the other side. But there's a lot there. So pick your biggest piece and then we'll move on. And then after the break.
Yeah. What's the biggest piece? Well, well, first of all, again, I'm addressing what's permissible and not what is necessarily prudent at the moment. People think that's evasive, but that's just how people do. At least classically do politics is you have to
desirable. We're saying this is desirable.
Well, it's only desirable if it's in the proper circumstances. So like I said already, if you have a confident majority can actually permit minorities to fully participate. But I mean, if you were in a situation in which the non-Christians wanted human sacrifice, or they wanted mutilation, like ritualistic mutilation or female circumcision or something to that effect, I think we would all probably say maybe they shouldn't have these rights to implement those policies. So again, in that circumstance, it would be permissible for Christians to say, yeah, the human sacrifices will stop. And if that's what you desire, then we're going to not allow you to bring that about.
Yeah, and that's all right. So we're going to stop right there. We're going to pick back up after this quick break. And Mike, I will give you a chance after that break, both of you, because there's a lot more to unpack here. I'm Billy Hallowell, and you're listening to Unbelievable, the show that deals with the questions that matter. Today, we're debating politics, faith, and the much debated idea of Christian nationalism. How do our worldviews influence us as citizens of the countries we live in? It's a complex topic. Whether you live in the US or the UK, you might have different takes and views on this. In a moment, we will return to the discussion. Hit that subscribe button if you're on YouTube, and take a moment to rate the podcast on Apple Podcast. And as always, you can email us at unbelievable@premier.org.uk or get in touch with us on social media. It's at UnbelievableFE for X, formerly known as Twitter, or at Premier Unbelievable for Instagram. Or you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Premier Unbelievable if you want to interact with us there. My guests are Stephen Wolfe and Michael Bird. Don't go away.
We are launching a brand new course which helps us to consider the evidence and questions around the birth of Jesus. It's called Did It Really Happen? The Birth of Jesus. Why not sign up for the course or gift it to a friend? Find out more at premierunbelievable.com.
Welcome back. In these fractured times, is there any chance we can ever agree on what is the common good or goods in our society? What role do we as individuals play in creating the kind of society we want to live in? We are here talking politics, Christian nationalism, and how do we engage in politics while adhering to our core beliefs? I want to welcome both of you back to the show here. I want to pick up where we left off on that last segment there. Stephen, you were putting some of your response out. I want to just give you a moment to wrap up anything you were saying there. And then, Mike, you're going to finish off that conversation. Then we're going to get into how do Christians actually need to behave in our current politics. But take it away, Stephen.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that in certain cases, that they, depending on the characteristics of the non-Christian group, that you can make it so that they are not entitled or don't have the sort of equal political rights as the Christian majority or the Christian leadership, the Christian core group within that nation. And that's precisely because there's some characteristic of that minority in which you don't want them to assert their political will, because it's bad, it's evil. And not only evil in a sort of kind of like a disagreement, but in a fundamental good. And something like I mentioned, human sacrifice or mutilation or something like that, where that would be very bad. I mean, that doesn't really happen very much anymore, but that's just an example of, I think, where we could say, wait, why would we give people who want this sort of these actions or these sort of policies to have power?
Now, Mike, I want to throw it back to you. I know there were a couple things you wanted to respond to on this, so you can do that now.
Yeah, I understand the problem where you've got some group that holds a view or wants to practice something that's not in the public or interest or in the interest of some other group. So someone wants to introduce, Sharia law, or someone wants to make it mandatory for all, 6-year-old kids to go to, drag queen story time. I understand that people, you might be conscious about that, but the solution to that problem is not rescinding the political equality of different groups. The solution is to have a very good constitution that safeguards the rights and protections. So if you've got a good constitution, which is the law that all laws must be under, and there's also a way of protecting minorities against a majority, whether Christian or otherwise. I think a good constitution can safeguard the things that Stephen's concerned about. It doesn't require rescinding the political equality of any group in your society.
Stephen, do you view it as rescinding the political equality? Because that's a very specific verbiage there. I mean, is that how you see it, or do you see it in a different light?
Just to state the principle, I think it's permissible for Christians to deem certain groups to have positions that are detrimental to the fundamental features of society and to rescind their political equality. That's not to say they're thrown in prison or like that, but it's that if they have positions that would be, if they had power, would be detrimental to the foundation of good order, good state, and political society, then they can be rescinded. Now, if you have a constitution that does effectively deal with those issues and those policies, then yeah, you would need to rescind their political equality because it would work. I don't think that the issue, and as an American with a written constitution, I don't have a whole lot of confidence that that these constitutional documents are magical and somehow actually bind people well to what's actually said in them. So I don't have a whole lot of confidence in like this magic document sort of mentality of a constitution. Even within a common law tradition, you have to have a commitment to ancestral, like a reception of that. And if people are not willing to receive that and they're going to go their own way, then of course there's going to be a problem. Same thing with the U.S. Constitution. If people are willing to, if they're going to try to seek to apply what it says, well, and it actually does restrain those evils, then good. Yeah, that's fine. Again, I'm just dealing with, you're addressing something in the book that where, again, I'm as a political theorist talking about like addressing questions of political theory. And you may not like agree with the conclusion, but I think I don't know about you, but people have read it and they think, oh, hey, Wolfe wants to have this Christian minority dominate the majority. That's what he wants, and that's not really what I'm doing. I'm just addressing questions that I identify and then deal with them. And then I think I'm fairly clear overall that like everything depends upon circumstances, but these things are still permissible in principle. So,
Stephen, I want to throw out to you, and then I want to come back to you, Mike, on this. But where do you, as a little bit of a challenge on this, where do you draw the line, on that, right? If you are to say, well, these particular ideas are bad ideas that would damage us, who defines that within the Christian realm, and where do you then draw that line? Because there are people who will argue things And they may even have substantial numbers on their side that some people may not be comfortable with. Or maybe there are perspectives people would like to see represented that you're then saying can no longer be represented because of holding to that particular potential ideology.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, well, you're just asking an age-old question of politics. It doesn't matter if it's my position or it's like any policy at all. It's a question of how do you decide upon a question of politics. So this is just an age-old perennial question, and so it's not unique to my position or anyone else's position. It's just the age-old. So yeah, I mean, the stock answer is that the political community deliberates upon their understanding of the good. And they see the circumstances and they enact the policies and the laws that they think will best conduce to the good of their political community. It's a stock answer, but I don't know. I don't think I must offer like a better answer than anyone else trying to address the same question for any other question. There's questions of, well, who gets to decide how long someone who commits manslaughter should go to prison? Like, is it 2, 10 years? What's the minimum? What's the maximum? I mean, these are just perennial questions of politics.
Yeah. And I would just add, I think the concern, and I'm going to speak to the other side of this in a moment and ask some questions to Mike on this. I think the concern is there going to be abuse of power? And Mike, feel free to jump in on this. Abuse of power on behalf of the Christians who then have the power, whereas these other disenfranchised groups potentially don't. I think that's one of the concerns that people have when it does come to this.
Right. Yeah, I would just say again, that's just the common problem of politics. If you're going to hand anyone a power to punish or to execute or to throw people in prison, there's going to be abuse. Now, I think a better question would be: is this the case in which like abuse could more likely happen, and so it's very imprudent to use it in these cases to take people's rights? That's a legitimate question. So like because then that person, it becomes one of these struggling democracies in like Africa, where they have a democracy and then suddenly just collapses and they try to redo it again. And tyranny is a cycle of tyranny and democracy. Yeah, it's the same issue here, and I think it's a legitimate question. Like within the like typical Western society, it would be so almost like a contrary or a second nature to do that it would seriously, probably psychologically impossible to do it, first of all, but also it could be dangerous in the long run. It could erode certain rights and principles over the long run. It could actually damage our political system, which is a matter of prudence. But again, I think it's permissible to do in certain cases. I mean, these are just very complex questions of I don't know. I'm trying to evade like any sort of like answer or criticism. It's just it really kind of depends. I'm a particularist in the sense that like what's the political tradition of the United States? Of Australia? What's France? Of Egypt? Of whatever? And you have to determine what you ought to do. You have your principles. You have the end you want to achieve in your political order, and then you say, how can I achieve the maximum good given the circumstances? Because if I implement this severe policy, then there's going to be subversion and revolution, and well, that didn't work, and so you got to then pull it back a little bit or do something else. And so, I'm very much saying you have to embed your policies in the actual characteristics of the place.
And these are difficult questions to grapple with. I will say on the flip side, and Mike, I'm going to come to you in a moment here, but we have seen a couple in America of moments of litmus tests almost being set during congressional hearings. We've seen a couple of times, and it's actually been people on the more secular side of things who have imposed those things on some of the Christians, actually, which is interesting in this discussion, that we have seen some of those debates happen with some senators who were sitting senators at the time, one of them still a sitting senator. So, coming back to you, Michael, when we look at this issue, there's such a back and forth on Christian nationalism, the power you were speaking about before, whether or not people think they need to be in charge. The flip side of that, though, is what are Christians supposed to do politically, right? Because when Christians do come forward and say, hey, we want to be a part of the process, we want our values to be reflected in in the law. You know, we want to see that happen. We want to see ourselves and the people we elect. They're often being accused at moments of being Christian nationalists. So how, in your view, should Christians politically behave?
Well, I think this may be one of the few rare areas that Stephen and I are in agreement. Neither of us are Anabaptists. We don't believe we should simply be on the margins of society in our own little farm, you know, reading Luther's, you know, translation of the Bible. We believe Christians can be politically involved, and they can be a force for good. That's why that's why we had people like William Wilberforce, and other, Christian leaders over the centuries who have been a positive influence. So I think Christians can undertake public office. They can speak to political policy. They can engage in political debate. They can serve in the apparatus of government as well. And that can be an expression of their Christian vocation. But with that, you've also got to say that government works best with the consent of the governed, okay? And it's, if you want to, introduce something like, Sabbath observance, like, so there'll be no trading on Sunday, which that's fine if it meets with the consensus of the governed. But if the governed don't want it, then it's going to be a hard sell to impose it.
Yeah, and Stephen, what would you add to that when it comes in particular to how you think Christians should engage? We've heard a little bit of what you think on this, but how do we engage in a healthy way if we're Christians in that political process?
Well, I think we have to. I've already kind of said it, that we have to define. We have to understand what the goods are that we're seeking in society. We have to have a conception of what is good based upon the human being, the nature of the social nature of the human being, both, not only in its temporal, but also eternal. I've already said that. But like, once you understand what that good is, then that would be universal. It'd be true for all political communities. Then you have to say, well, on the ground, what can we actually accomplish? And so I agree with Mike that if it's 10% of people, somehow the Christians want the Sabbath laws, and they somehow have power and they do the Sabbath law, and now 90% of the people are like, well, we don't believe that, then yeah, it's not going to work. So it's a pointless policy in the first place. But I do think if you're 60, 70, 80% and the people want it and then they enact it, and you have the political will to enforce it, then that's good. The 20% of the people don't like it, but that's politics. We can't wait for 100% consent on each policy. It's a majority rule, at least within that sense. But yeah, it comes down to what's the good and how do you bring it about. So I think that's all kind of mundane, like political principles. But I would say that Christians should have a stronger, compared to what it is today, I think we used to have a stronger political will for that good. So instead of having kind of this sense in which our politics is a witness to the elites or to the regime or whatever, that instead of thinking in terms of how do I look as good as possible to the rulers of the age, instead we should think more in terms of what the good and then the means to actually bring it about. And that's where I would disagree with a lot of modern evangelicals, at least in the United States, because they tend, everything in politics is about this sort of witness, looking a certain way in front of kind of what I would call the American regime. But we need a more assertive will. And I think we could actually get a lot done if we kind of revitalize that.
Michael, there are a lot of people warning that Christian nationalism is not only incredibly dangerous, but it's one of the biggest threats. We hear this a lot in America. How pervasive, in your view, is this issue of Christian nationalism? Is it as big of an issue as it's being made? Is it as dangerous as it's being said? And what leads you to your conclusion on that?
Oh, I think it's mixed. At one level, Christian nationalism has become something of the boogeyman of the political left. You often get the impression with, like, every evangelical church has got a little altar to Donald Trump somewhere in the corner. Or it's defined so broadly that anyone who is politically conservative and Christian gets defined and denounced as a Christian nationalist. So at one level, I do think there is a little bit of fear-mongering about this. It is a little bit of overly prescribed into who counts as a Christian nationalist. But be that as it may, if you look at some of the people, the Christian groups who are coalescing around, Donald Trump and various others, and how they're putting forward their own view of Christian nationalism, I would say it is a small but very loud and influential group in the United States. Well, I mean, I'm in Australia. Stephen will be more the expert on this. That's my position on it. But I would also point out, I mean, I've just finished reading a great book by Neil Sayre, who's an Indian American who now teaches in Singapore. And he's just done a book called The Global Politics of Jesus. And he does a great survey on global expressions of Christian nationalism in Latin America and in Africa as well. And he points out the sort of what happens in other countries where you get sort of Christian nationalist impulses, or where Christianity provides religious capital to bolster or legitimize a political regime, which I think is a little bit different from what Stephen's on about. But Sayre's book is very good at how this can occur in context outside America. So yeah, I think it's a loud and somewhat influential thing, and certainly halls of power. But I don't think it's quite as ubiquitous as the progressive left would have us imagine. But I'll happily let Stephen give us his 2 cents on that topic.
Yeah, what do you make of that, Stephen? Especially the claims of the danger. I mean, when you're talking about this being the most dangerous threat to America, essentially, in the political sense, what's your response to that?
Well, I don't. When someone says Christian nationalism is scary, it doesn't bother me at all, or dangerous, because of course, I mean, my position, my views on politics are directly opposed to the people who are scared by it. So I'm not going to say it's not scary. I'm not going to say it's not dangerous. For them, they're actually, according to their premises, it's rational for them, I guess, to be scared. So it doesn't bother me. But I do think, I mean, I would agree that the term is used in this, this way to just kind of denounce a bunch of people who really have never heard of the term, and they're really just being kind of normal evangelical politics, and all of a sudden it's Christian nationalism, which has the nationalism, which is scary. Because that pretty much nowadays, like all politics is trying to assert which group is scary and which group is not scary. But yeah, I think that, I mean, I want to say that it's a bigger influence than Mike would say, but there are different streams, there are different views, and most people who kind of fall under the label, at least used by the sociologist, wouldn't even know what the term is or affirm it. So it is. Yeah, and I come from a more reformed background, and usually people think of Christian nationalists as being the more hardcore ones, at least in terms of the sociologists. They'd be more Pentecostal, and they would affirm views that I reject. So I don't think like America is the new Israel. I don't think the Constitution is divine or some sort of inspired document. So anyway, but I do think I mean, I guess in my defense, if people are thinking, he's just now appropriating the term to get book sales. I mean, certainly there is that element of it. I didn't think that, but that's true. The media keeps it going for me. But it really, my view is a sort of nationalism. It is a sort of nationalism, but it's defined according to how I define it. So I'm not appealing to old, nationalisms, but yeah, but I mean, yeah, it's all over the place in terms of the term. There's mine, which is I'd call it political theory, and then there's a sociological term, which I think is activist oriented. I think it's meant to demonize people, so
quiet them down, maybe keep them out of the process, maybe to some degree, potentially.
Yeah, I think it's a label to capture essentially the people who are most like fiercely opposed to what most of like elite Americans affirm. So if you look at white evangelical political beliefs, they tend to be the outliers on a lot of things. And then the elites tend to be on the opposite side of that. And so if you have a term that demonizes those people and makes them sound scary, it can be very politically effective for political activism.
Michael, you were going to say something. I want to give you the last word on this question.
Yeah, I think you've got to differentiate, Mike Flynn, the former national security advisor, going around speaking in charismatic churches, doing his kind of traveling roadshow, which has a Christian nationalist ethos to it, and compare that with someone like Stephen, who I think kind of wants to live out Book 4 of Calvin's Institutes, which I think would be a more of a distinction between the two different types of Christian political separation. I'm assuming that Stephen probably sees him closer to Book 4 of Calvin's Institutes than he does to Mike Flynn.
Very good. Very good. Well, we have to take a quick break in a moment, and we're going to get back into another segment and dive into plenty more on this topic, but we want to know what you think. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. Take a moment to follow or rate the podcast. You can always get in touch with us on social media. It's at Unbelievable FE on X, at Premier Unbelievable for Instagram. And you can also find us on Facebook at the same address. And if you want to interact with us, do so on our Facebook page or any of the above places I just mentioned. Now, my guests today are Mike Bird, author of a new book with New Testament scholar Tom Wright, who's also going to be coming on Unbelievable very soon. That book is Jesus and the Powers, Christian Political Witness in an Age of Totalitarian Terror and Dysfunctional Democracies, and Stephen Wolfe, whose book The Case for Christian Nationalism caused a stir when it was published in 2022. We'll be right back in a moment.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question. We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms. The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. The difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online, so thanks again.
Welcome back. You're listening to Unbelievable, the show that gets Christians, skeptics, agnostics, and all those in between thinking about the topics that matter to all of us. We're heading into our third segment here, and Mike Bird and Stephen Wolfe are back with me. Let's get right back into it. Now, Michael, I want to come to you because, is it possible, if your arguments on, Christian nationalism are true, and if this is a growing problem, let's say, that some of that might be being perpetuated by certain laws, regulations, changes in culture that have maybe been hostile to Christians in some way, or that have maybe forced people into feeling as though they need to take more political action? I mean, what's your thought on that?
Oh, it's a bit of both. On the one hand, certainly American evangelicals have always had the instinct that they should be in charge. I think that's been there from the very beginning. But it is certainly intensified and provoked when you have progressive governments, or as the elite class, who treat people of faith with a certain degree of contempt. And I believe that is genuinely real at times. And we get that in Australia, where you get the kind of snide, snarky, Ivy League class. You look down on contempt on people of faith, and particularly on the white rural working class. So but I think that's an amplifying condition. I think this idea that, Christians or evangelicals have to be in charge just simply runs fairly consistently through the American political tradition in the last 200 years.
I'd agree with that. But I would say it's a good thing. But so I think our valuation is opposite. But yeah.
Well, let me just, and the idea of need to be in charge, is it a question of need to be in charge? I'd love to hear from both of you on this, and I'll start with you, Stephen. Need to be in charge because they just want to be in charge for no reason, or wanting to take control in some way to help bring society to a place that they believe would be most fulfilling for it? I mean, those are very different things, Stephen.
Yeah, I think from very early on, I think during the founding and 19th century, and I'd say the early 20th century as well, on both what we consider the left and the right, considered that America was a Protestant nation, and that it wasn't simply the Protestantism itself, but that the Protestant nature was necessary for American liberties. So there was this idea of the liberties of America are attached to Protestantism. And if you're a Roman Catholic, then you can't adequately, ordinarily affirm and support those liberties, largely because you're beholden to a foreign power, namely the Vatican or the Pope. And also Roman Catholics or the papacy was very opposed to those liberties. And so they viewed Protestantism, and even like a sort of Anglo-Protestantism, meaning the political liberties developed in England that came over and understood those as being a distinct, almost like ethnic religious type of body of liberties, though affirming them to be universal. And so, yeah, according to that assumption, it would make sense that they would say, hey, in order to maintain American liberties, we want an Anglo-Protestant country. And that the Anglo-Protestant was actually, I'd say, radically open in the sense that Germans, and that there was a sense in which people could come here and become that Anglo-Protestant ethnicity in a sense, even though they have different ancestry. But and that's because there was confidence. We could go on that, but I do think there is, at least according to the assumptions, a legitimate view or reason to want to maintain a Protestant America. And that really endured until maybe like it started kind of, the cracks were like post World War I, and then post World War II, the mainline churches collapsed, and now we have what we have today. So, but yeah, for most of our history, it was a sense of Protestantism was the dominant necessary religion for our own liberties.
What say you, Mike?
I would agree. I think missional Protestantism has been the basis for a more libertarian style of government, okay, or a focus on liberties from the tyrannies that were experienced in Europe. So I think I think the Protestant tradition is responsible for that. And that's, I think numerous historians and political historians would say the same thing. Where I would disagree with Stephen is that in that political Protestantism, what it became apparent very early was the necessity of the separation of church and state. And I think it's interesting that Stephen's finished a postdoc at the Madison Center, and James Madison was one of the foremost champions of the separation of church and state in America. And he said, the separation of church and state has been better for the state, and it's also increased piety and devotion. It means the clergy are less indolent. They're not having to rely on being backed up or supported by the state. So Madison was a champion as a Protestant for the separation of church and state. So I think, yeah, the Protestant origins of a liberal democracy are definite, and we should remember them, rehearse them, and thank God for them. But I think the trajectory very quickly goes away from an absolute Christian nationalism into a more libertarianism, as certainly in matters of religion.
Well, and I would add before you jump in, Stephen, that separation of church and state is another one of those terms in America that's become like Christian nationalism, where when you say it, people have different definitions of what they think it actually is, right? And I know that even saying that, it might be controversial, but it is a reality. You can have people on the left and the right having very different viewpoints on what that looks like, but you make a great point there. Anything you want to add on that front, Stephen?
Yeah, so I agree that Protestantism is largely responsible for at least the sense of liberality, or what we call liberalism. I forget when that word was first used. I think it was used in the mid 19th century, but there was a sense of the idea of political liberties or liberty itself and being attached to Protestantism. So I agree with that, and I would argue that even like religious liberty is a product of Protestantism working out its principles, because within Protestantism you can have a line of churches, a Baptist, Presbyterian, even Anglican, along the same street, and we could all look at each other, hopefully, and we can affirm each other's mutual faith, because we're not Roman Catholics who see that you're only part of the one true visible Church of Christ, which is, with his head in Vatican. So we can actually all affirm mutual faith. And so over time, over experience, Protestants were able to say, look, maybe we don't have to suppress each other. Maybe we can have a kind of pan-Protestant political order where we do affirm that, yes, this political order is Protestant, but we're going to tolerate our differences because we can get along and we can have our communities, we can have our discussion and dialogue. So I would agree. And I've always said, like, the 19th century America post, the last disestablishment was in like the early 1830s. I think that was all, it was fine. But nevertheless, there was an intense sense among Americans that this is a Christian nation. This was the basis of the social gospel among kind of the left in the early 20th century. And it really wasn't, I would say, until post-World War II era when that started to fall. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'd agree with a lot of what you said. I just don't think what has happened in the last 80 years, I guess, 70 years has actually been good. And I think it's precisely because, well, there's a lot of reasons. I want to keep rambling on about that, but
well, I wanted to shift gears a little bit to talk about, creating a Jesus kingdom, on earth and what that looks like. And one of the areas that comes up in this conversation a lot is voting, because people, they vote on for a variety of different reasons, on a variety of different bases. But Mike, when it comes to voting, what's your take? I mean, should people of faith always vote? Do they not always need to vote? What is sort of the hard and fast rule that Christians should follow on that front?
In Australia, I don't know where you know this, but voting is compulsory. If you don't vote, you can get fined. It's about a $20 fine, so it's not going to break the bank. But I actually like the idea.
Is it enforced?
For a number.
Is that enforced?
Very loosely, very loosely. You normally get like a warning notice saying, "We noticed you didn't vote in the last election." But I mean, like, the fine is like $20. But it means we get like 98% turnout in our elections, which means you don't have to mobilize the base, either the left wing or the right wing, to get out. Everyone just goes out. They have voting booths. We have what's called democracy sausages, where we have a bit of a barbecue. We have some hot dogs, or if you're left wing, maybe they have like, cannabis flavored tofu or something, but we get out and we go to our voting booths. And, everyone votes. And I think it's a good idea, because I think if you're going to be part of a country, you should participate in its political apparatus. I think, political apathy is a very big sin. So I like compulsory voting in Australia, because it means citizens then have to be informed. They've got to think about what's going on in politics and who they're going on to vote for. And if you don't like any candidate, what you can do, you just take your ballot, write on it, stick it to the man, and then just throw it in the box. That's called an invalid vote. But everyone's got to turn up and vote in theory. And yeah, I think Christians certainly should, because if you want your country to be governed according to principles or to seek a common good, voting is the way you do it. I'd rather change the country with voting rather than with tanks or bombs.
Stephen, a lot to actually respond to there on the compulsory side too, because that wasn't something I was very familiar with. So that's interesting. What would you say?
So I don't have any problem with that policy in itself. I don't think it could be. We could have a national law, because I don't see how in the Constitution you could do that. I'm not actually 100% sure if it would be constitutional. Maybe it would be. I'd have to look into it. So I don't have a view one way or the other. It doesn't offend me by instinct to compulse that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, it sounds good. Perhaps I don't know, but part of me, if someone is apathetic, I kind of don't want them to vote. A lot of times it's as I understand, usually it's the lower information voter who doesn't vote, and that's probably a good thing. But yeah.
So would you be okay with some Christians just not saying, hey, I'm not? I mean, there are some Christians who say, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, and I'm not going to vote. I mean, you hear this. This is an argument that's made. What is your response to that kind of argument, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean that there's like theological, that would be a kind of almost like a radical Anabaptist perspective. I think there's some, but I mean on the opposite side you have the Covenanter types, and there are those as well. And the Covenanters would say I can't vote for anyone that isn't a Christian, and so they wouldn't vote either. I think the problem with that is that you have as citizens, you have a mechanism to express your interest in and to express what you think the common good should be, and we have it through representatives. And so, my argument would be, in order to love your neighbor within our political system, you'd have to vote for the representative who is most likely to enact policies, but that you prefer. But I mean, if the list of candidates, if there's no candidate in the list that you think and you think like each one of them would actually harm society, then you may not want to vote at all. But yeah, I think it's a mechanism for loving your neighbor through politics.
Mike, how do we build a culture that aligns with the values that we want to build without, in your view, maybe crossing a line into that Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I think what you need to do is you need good Christian leaders who can speak with power, conviction, and a way that is persuasive, and show that Christian principles, the Christian vision for society, is actually good for human beings. It's good to live a life as a Christian, and it's good to live in a society that's been formed by Christian values. And I would even ask that in our somewhat more secularizing world, that is most likely the most important political task we have today, reminding people that many of those rights and privileges that they enjoy and celebrate and embrace, they did not emerge in a vacuum. They're not written on the rings of Saturn. It's not self-evident that all men are created equal. It wasn't evident to the Mongols. It wasn't evident to the Arabs. It wasn't self-evident to the Aztecs. It's evident to people who have read Genesis 1:26-28, that all human beings are in the image of God. It's evident to people who have read Galatians 3:28, that in Christ there's neither slave nor free, nor Jew nor Gentile, neither male and female, but all one in Christ Jesus. So I think one of the most urgent political tasks is to remind people of the Christian basis of the basic values, freedoms, and liberties that they enjoy. And they weren't created by a bunch of French radicals during the 1790s in France.
Yeah, I mean, so I've said this already, but I agree that that Christian principles, particularly Protestantism, they've influenced our world, and I would affirm a type of liberalism. So I would characterize 19th century America as a form of liberalism, at least broadly. Of course, there's cases where that's not, big cases where that's not entirely liberal, but the general spirit was a sort of liberalism. And but what made it possible to maintain a sense of Christian identity and also maintain a certain degree of like cultural Christianity and cultural Protestantism was a Christian culture. It was a Christian people understanding themselves as such, and this is, you can't take this sense of liberalism or liberality without the sort of constraints that come with a Christian culture. So if you don't have these social constraints, but then you add liberalism to it, you get moral anarchy and chaos. So I don't think, even though I think liberalism is in some ways an ideal arrangement in the old style, it has to have cultural conditions behind it in order for it to actually function well. And of course, it never functioned perfectly. But in our day today, without some sort of religious grounding, it's just going to be moral anarchy. And I think that's what we see today.
Mike, any thoughts on that? Because it is interesting to watch moments where you have people like Richard Dawkins agreeing on certain issues more with some Christians than, I mean, it's really interesting. You're watching, because of what I think Stephen just described, new alliances form and people sort of shifting and trying to make sense of some of those changes that are happening.
I definitely think, if we forget or renounce our Christian heritage, and this is happening in certain jurisdictions, and partly in Australia, it's not going to turn out well. Let me give you an example. Canada and the Netherlands are about to make it permissible to euthanize people with autism. Now, autism is very much a spectrum. It's not just all like Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman stuff. Or in Canada, they had a survey about whether people who are homeless or drug addicts or just really depressed, whether they can seek euthanasia as well. And something like 60% of people under the age of 30 said yes. That's definitely indicative of a post-Christian nation, where instead of believing in the image of God means all human beings have inherent value and rights, your value is determined by your capacity for pleasure and a very intensified view of autonomy. Okay, so what's determining the value of human beings is not something that's universal and inherent in every human being. It's your capacity for pleasure and this maintenance of absolute autonomy. That is indicative of a post-Christian world, and it's going to lead to some really, really ugly results. But for me, the solution to that is not, let's make Christianity great again and attain positions of power where we can impose it. We need a better evangelistic effort. We need a much better political apologetic for why people are going to a place that will be championing the same sorts of views and philosophies that we used to execute people for after the Nuremberg trials. Okay, that they're coming into a post-Christian world that is going to be a type of anti-humanity ethos, and that's the real scary part from my mind.
Yeah, and can you see how there are people who would say, well, if we were to elect, though, parliaments or congresses filled with people who were Christians, these laws wouldn't pass, these things wouldn't happen, and over time, perhaps the culture would change. Do you understand where some of those people come from? And would you say that ideology of, hey, we should elect Christians to these positions, that does cross into Christian nationalism at all? I'm just kind of curious on where you would see that sort of dynamic.
I wouldn't call that Christian nationalism. Saying we should get good Christian men and women elected into public office, that's not Christian nationalism. That's called democracy. I mean, 80% of Fiji is Christian. So if 80% of the people in the Fijian parliament are Christian, that's not Christian nationalism. That's just democracy. If the elected parliaments, Congress, Senate, whatever if they reflect the values and demographics of the people, that's not Christian nationalism. That's just plain democracy. And if the people so governed want a Christian view of looking after the disabled, if they want political equality for everyone, if they want to create a society where everyone sits under their own vine and fig tree and none shall make them afraid because it's found in Scripture, that is a good thing. That's not Christian nationalism. And I believe faith and values can inform our politics. Okay, that's I think to say otherwise, I believe, would be a mistake, and it would be a misinterpretation of what the separation of church and state means.
That was very helpful. And I know we've danced around that in a couple of different arenas, but having you sort of say that was very helpful. And I can't believe we're rounding out to the end of our conversation here. I want to give you the last word, Stephen, on what you just heard there. Because again, when we talk about Christian nationalism, there are people who would say what I just described to Mike and what he just described, that it is Christian nationalism. You would obviously, well, tell me what you would say.
Yeah, I think just having Christians, people who politicians who identify as Christian in office, that would be, presumably good in certain policies. But But I think a comprehensive vision for society would not just be temporal things; it would be higher things, it would be spiritual, heavenly things. And this is where I think that I would probably, the reason I'd push back against liberal democracy as it's conceived of today is it has a very thin conception of what the common good is, or it reduces the common good. I don't know if Mike, you've affirmed this, but probably not. But it's the idea that you kind of, each person can kind of define for themselves their own meaning of existence, as long as it doesn't harm someone else. And I think that's a poor, very, very poor principle to organize a society. So I think there should be a thicker conception of what is good, at the very least, in terms of like just natural principles of what's good and proper. And those should be a Christian vision. A Christian politician should see his or her work as bringing those principles, applying those more comprehensive principles to society, given what they can in their position. And then ideally, if they can, to go elevate it to higher things as well.
Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time. We actually have to leave it there. We've got to finish the show there. There was a lot of great discussion there. You've been listening to Stephen Wolfe and Michael Bird. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Let us know your thoughts. Send us your questions on email. It's unbelievable@premier.org.uk, or on social media on X at unbelievablefe, or on Facebook and Instagram at Premier Unbelievable. Please rate and review on your podcast provider. It's always a huge help to Unbelievable. It helps get the podcast seen by those who don't know about us yet. For now, I'm Billy Hallowell, and it's been great to be with you, and we'll see you again next time for more Unbelievable. Until then, from me and the team, goodbye.